index.php. The backslash is probably there because just escape it, right? Otherwise, it would be any character, a wildcard. $1 is actually, you wouldn't really know this necessarily, and it's a little weird. We don't have a pointer here just yet. So the $1 is referring sort of forward-thinking-wise to whatever's going to be matched in parentheses on the next line. So by next line, I mean, that's OK. I'll find one later. So the next line is saying, all right, go ahead and match everything after the slash in the original URL and store it in a temporary variable, $1 by default. And it's the parentheses that do this. If you know PHP and you've used preg match before, you have the same notion of capturing parentheses. And what it's saying is, if so long as the file that was requested is not bang index.php, go ahead and pass this HTTP request along to, in the fourth line, that file index.php, but pass after it the slash file name that was actually originally requested. So in other words, if the user has not explicitly requested index.php, pretend that they have, and append to the end of that file name whatever was in the original URL. So what CodeIgniter is then capable of doing in its own index.php file, it has the ability through PHP's super globals, if you recall $_server and the like, to see what exactly was appended at the end of the file name that's in the URL that was requested. And it realizes, oh, that's /foo/bar/baz. Let me now require once foo.php. Let me go ahead and call the bar method, and let me pass to the bar method the very last thing at the end of that URL. So that's all that's happening there, and it's not even strictly necessary. It's really ultimately just an aesthetic detail so that your URLs don't look like, for instance, this here. Yeah?
I had a question. On the third line, the dot was not escaped with the backslash?
On the third, correct. So on the third line, it's actually not a regular expression that we're using. The third line is literally map this to index.php. So it's only the third line that involves a regex. So this is worth drawing your attention to, too, because right now we are saying that any request for a file other than index.php itself should get mapped to index.php. In other words, if I request /foo/bar/baz, actually pass that to index.php /foo/bar/baz. But what if the file the user is actually requesting is hello.jpg? Well, what's going to happen there? Well, a request for example.com/hello.jpg is actually going to get resolved to example.com/index.php/hello.jpg. Bad, right? Because that's obviously not the actual graphic file. So among the things you'll have to bear in mind is as you design this and future sites, and you actually have assets like CSS and JavaScript and images, realize that this dark magic actually does need to be tweaked so that you're not routing absolutely everything. And if you look in CodeIgniter's documentation, there's more sophisticated ways of doing this, so you don't have to hard code every possible file that you want to whitelist.
What does the L mean at the end of the fourth?
L just means last. So if you had other rewrite rules, this one would say stop executing here once it's matched. Another hand somewhere? Yeah?
How do you handle like more RESTful routes?
More RESTful routes? In what sense here?
In terms of like mapping the same thing if it's like a get or a post or a request?
Well, so we'll talk about REST later this semester, but for those unfamiliar, it essentially means using URLs to identify resources on a server. I mean, this can be used in precisely the same way to represent REST endpoints, whereby your REST endpoint could just be a controller that this then maps a request to.
But for like CodeIgniter, do you have to do all through basically rewrite rules, or is it like?
No. OK, no. I see where you're going. So short answer, no. And we'll see that in just a second. But for now, all this does is it gets rid of the ugliness of index.php, but it can certainly do much more. All right. So what was bad then about this design? So let me go into version 8 here and recall that we had a whole bunch of files. And they're summarized here in the README that accompanies each of these things. So we introduced last week CodeIgniter, and CodeIgniter came with a whole bunch of default directories, among which were application, among which was system, and among which was index.php. And then inside of those those directories were actually other files. So it takes a little bit of time to acclimate to all the stuff that's in here. What we did with the README files is pretty much do ... for anything that's not interesting to look at yet. So realize that you can focus your attention only on these things. And in answer to your question, routes.php contains some of the magic with which we we can do this mapping of URLs to actual methods. So let's take a look. This was the end result, recall. So we have the lectures page. I click lecture 0, and then I have these dynamically generated links to a PDF and to a video. So how did this actually work? Well, let me go back to the code. And let me go into last week's application directory. Let me go into my controllers directory. And we had just one file here. So there's two different controllers at play here. There's index.php, which came with the framework, and whose sole purpose in life is to route requests to controllers you actually wrote. So homepage.php is just an arbitrary name I came up with. It is in the controllers directory. And this is where I actually implemented the logic, the business logic of my program. So there's nothing aesthetic in here per se, but it does invoke the thing called the view. So how did I go about creating this controller? So the means by which CodeIgniter and a lot of these frameworks work is they give you some base classes. So recall object-oriented programming, where you can have a base class from which other things descend. And we'll come back to this before long. But for now, you can just take it, just assume that you must start any such controller with class homepage extends CI_controller. Kind of a stupid name, but that just means you get a bunch of functionality for free. What is the functionality you get for free? Well, because you are extending this CI controller class, and by that I mean there is a class that the CodeIgniter folks made that is called CI controller. And just conceptually, what you're doing is you're saying, I am now going to implement a class that's called homepage that contains every one of the methods and every one of the data fields as this class, but I might want to add my own, and I also might want to override some of the things in the parent class. So among the features I get for free by extending that class is this feature of index. So CodeIgniter assumes that if you implement a method called index, that is the method that's going to get invoked automatically if the URL visits if the user visits a URL of the form /homepage with no bar or baz. So just the name of the controller. Index will get invoked. Meanwhile, if you visit /homepage/lectures or homepage/lecture, notice that I'm calling each of these methods instead. So what do each of these methods do? They're almost all identical. So they're definitely following a pattern here. But on the very first line of index, the very first thing I do, recall, is I invoke my header. So the header is a view. It's sort of a partial view. And recall the header contained what? Like the fluffy stuff like open bracket HTML, body, head, and all of that stuff that we previously implemented manually ourselves. The footer contained the boring stuff like the close body tag and the close HTML tag. And then what is meant to be in this second view? Yeah?
The actual relevant view for the
exactly.
And the rest of the template.
So the minimal HTML that itself constitutes the index page. Not the header, not the footer, but just the body of that page. Similarly for lectures. If you visit /lectures, I want to see as before the header. I want to see as before the footer. But then in between those two chunks of HTML, I want to see specifically the view called homepage/lectures. And then a similar story for the lecture method. But notice the one interesting difference about the lecture method is that it takes an argument. And when I kept saying /foo/bar/baz before, $n represents which of those variables? So baz, right? The very last thing, in this case, in the URL. And it will be automatically passed in by CodeIgniter to this method. And then notice the interesting feature here is that my view in advance is not going to know what lecture I want. It would be kind of bad design if I had 13 or so different lecture pages that were all manually hard-coded. Much better if I can have one and pass in dynamically an argument like n so that it can parameterize itself and display content for that particular lecture. So now notice these paths, template/header, homepage/index, template/footer. If I actually get out of my controllers folder and go into views, there are those two subdirectories. Let's go into templates because it's the simplest of them thus far. And there's the header. This is code that we wrote ourselves early on. Notice that I'm echoing a title in two different places. I'm calling HTML special charge just in case we accidentally spit out something dangerous. But where is title defined? Where did that come from? I haven't actually, yeah.
Passed it in an array.
Yeah, so recall in the controller that you can pass in an associative array of variables. And in that associative array, in this case, was a variable called title. And how is that implemented? Well, if you think back to like version 2 or 3 from last week, you can implement this same idea of templates yourself. PHP has the extract function. So if you call extract on a variable, on an associative array, it explodes that array so that all of the keys become actual variables. Much like title in this view is an actual variable, and there's no mention anymore of the array that was passed in. Footer, meanwhile, just looks like this, completely uninteresting. So lastly, in views, here's the home page folder of views. There's index, there's lecture, there's lecturers, and these two are fairly trivial right now.